What you're about to hear is a tale so terrifying, so steeped in ancient evil and human desperation, that it has haunted the sugar plantations of Louisiana for over a century. This is not merely a story of workers who lost their way in treacherous swampland or fell victim to natural predators. This is the documented account of 19 men who ventured into the forbidden depths of Honey Island Swamp in search of salvation from their crushing deaths, and the 3 survivors whose testimonies would expose a horror so profound that it challenged everything the people of Louisiana thought they knew about the world around them. This is the true story of the Boudreaux Plantation incident, where desperation led to damnation, and where the price of freedom was measured in human souls. The year was 1887, and the sugar industry of Louisiana was experiencing one of its most brutal periods in the post-Civil War era. The abolition of slavery had fundamentally altered the economic landscape of the South, but it had not eliminated the exploitation of workers. It had merely changed its form. The sugar plantations that dotted the fertile parishes along the Mississippi River now relied on a system of sharecropping and debt peonage that kept former slaves and poor whites trapped in cycles of poverty as crushing as any chains. Among the most notorious of these operations was the Boudreaux Plantation, located in St. Tammany Parish near the edge of the vast Honey Island Swamp. Owned by Augustine Boudreaux, a man whose cruelty was legendary even by the harsh standards of post-Reconstruction Louisiana, the plantation had earned a reputation as a place where workers entered but rarely left, their debts mysteriously growing faster than their ability to pay them off. Augustine Boudreaux was the 3rd generation of his family to own the plantation, inheriting not only vast tracts of fertile land but also a legacy of exploitation that stretched back to the darkest days of slavery. Standing 6 feet tall with steel-gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look right through a person, Boudreaux commanded fear and respect in equal measure throughout the parish. His voice carried the cultured accent of old Louisiana aristocracy, but those who worked for him knew that beneath his gentleman's facade lurked a mind capable of calculating cruelty with mathematical precision. The plantation itself sprawled across nearly 10,000 acres of some of the most productive sugar land in Louisiana. The main house, a magnificent Greek Revival mansion with towering white columns and expansive galleries, sat like a crown jewel at the center of the operation, but it was the workers' quarters that told the true story of life on the Boudreaux Plantation. Ramshackle buildings that housed dozens of families in conditions that differed little from the slave quarters they had replaced. The sugar mill that processed the plantation's crop was a marvel of industrial engineering, its massive steam-powered machinery capable of crushing thousands of tons of cane during the grinding season. But the mill's efficiency came at a terrible human cost, as workers labored 16-hour days in conditions that were both backbreaking and dangerous. Accidents were common, and those who were injured often found their medical expenses added to their already insurmountable debts. It was this system of debt peonage that trapped the 19 men who would eventually venture into Honey Island Swamp on that fateful October morning in 1887. These workers, a mixture of former slaves and poor whites, had all fallen victim to Boudreaux's carefully constructed web of financial obligation. They owed money for their housing, their food, their tools, their medical care, and even their transportation to the plantation. No matter how hard they worked or how many hours they labored, their debts only seemed to grow larger with each passing month. Among the 19 were some of the most skilled and experienced sugar workers in the parish. There was Samuel Washington, a former slave who had worked sugar cane his entire life and whose knowledge of the crop was encyclopedic. Despite his expertise and decades of labor, Samuel found himself owing over $300 to the plantation store, a sum that would have taken him years to repay even if he had been allowed to keep every penny of his wages. Another member of the group was Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, a Cajun whose family had worked the sugar fields for generations. Jean-Baptiste was known throughout the parish for his ability to predict the weather and his uncanny sense of when the cane was ready for harvest, but his gambling problem had led him to borrow money from Augustine Boudreaux at usurious interest rates, and now he owed nearly $500, more than most workers could earn in 2 years. The group also included Marcus Freeman, a young black man whose father had died in the sugar mill's machinery, leaving behind a widow and 5 children. Marcus had taken on his father's debts in addition to his own, creating a financial burden that seemed impossible to overcome through honest labor. His desperation was evident to anyone who looked into his eyes, which held the haunted quality of a man who saw no way out of his circumstances. From the white community came Patrick O'Malley, an Irish immigrant who had arrived in Louisiana with dreams of making his fortune in the sugar industry. Instead, he had found himself trapped in a system that seemed designed to keep him perpetually in debt. His thick brogue and quick temper had made him few friends among the plantation's management, and his debts had grown accordingly as he was charged for every perceived slight and infraction. The remaining 15 men represented a cross-section of Louisiana's working poor, Creoles whose families had been free before the war but who had been reduced to near slavery by economic necessity, Germans who had immigrated seeking opportunity but found only exploitation, and native-born Americans who had been driven to the sugar fields by poverty and lack of education. What united them all was their desperate desire to escape the crushing burden of debt that defined their existence. The catalyst for their fateful journey came in the form of a story that had been circulating among the workers for months. According to local legend, somewhere deep in the heart of Honey Island Swamp lay the ruins of an old Spanish mission where pirates had once hidden vast treasures. The story claimed that Jean Lafitte himself had buried chests of gold and silver in the mission's foundations, and that these riches remained undiscovered because of the swamp's treacherous terrain and supernatural guardians. The legend had been given new life by the arrival of an old Creole woman named Mama Bridget, who claimed to possess knowledge of the treasure's exact location. Mama Bridget was a practitioner of voodoo whose reputation for supernatural knowledge extended throughout the parish. She was a small, ancient woman with skin like weathered leather and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom and pain. Her voice carried the musical accent of the islands, and when she spoke of the treasure, even the most skeptical workers found themselves believing. Mama Bridget had approached the 19 men individually, speaking to each in private about their debts and their desperation. She claimed that the spirits had shown her visions of their suffering and had revealed to her the location of the treasure as a means of providing them with salvation. According to her account, the Spanish mission had been built on a site sacred to the native peoples, and the pirates who had used it as a hiding place had made pacts with supernatural entities to protect their wealth. The old woman's proposal was both simple and terrifying. She would guide the men to the treasure's location, but in return, they would have to participate in a ritual that would bind them to the spirits that guarded the wealth. The nature of this ritual was deliberately vague, but Mama Bridget assured them that it was necessary to gain the spirits' permission to remove the treasure. She warned them that the journey would be dangerous and that not all of them might return, but she emphasized that those who did survive would be wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. The decision to follow Mama Bridget into Honey Island Swamp was not made lightly. The 19 men met in secret over several weeks, debating the risks and benefits of the proposed expedition. They all knew that the swamp was one of the most dangerous places in Louisiana, home to alligators, poisonous snakes, and treacherous terrain that had claimed the lives of countless hunters and trappers over the years. But they also knew that their current situation was unsustainable, and that without some dramatic change in their circumstances, they would remain trapped in debt peonage for the rest of their lives. The swamp itself was a place of legend and fear throughout Louisiana. Honey Island Swamp covered over 70,000 acres of pristine wetlands on the Pearl River, straddling the border between Louisiana and Mississippi. The swamp was named for the wild honey that could be found there, produced by bees that nested in the hollow cypress trees that dominated the landscape. But despite its sweet name, the swamp had a dark reputation as a place where people disappeared without a trace and where strange creatures were said to roam the waterways. Local Native American tribes had long considered portions of the swamp to be sacred ground, off-limits to outsiders and protected by powerful spirits. The Choctaw people told stories of shape-shifting entities that could take the form of animals or humans, luring travelers deep into the swamp where they would become lost forever. These stories had been dismissed by white settlers as primitive superstition, but even the most skeptical residents of the area admitted that there was something unsettling about the deepest parts of Honey Island Swamp. The Spanish mission that Mama Bridget claimed to know about was based on historical fact. In the early 18th century, Spanish missionaries had indeed established several outposts in the region as part of their efforts to convert the native population to Christianity. Most of these missions had been abandoned when the Spanish withdrew from Louisiana, and their exact locations had been lost to time and the encroaching wilderness. The possibility that one of these missions might have been used by pirates as a hiding place was not entirely implausible, given the lawless nature of the Gulf Coast during the early 19th century. As October arrived and the sugar harvest began in earnest, the 19 men finalized their plans for the expedition. They would leave the plantation on a Sunday morning when most of the overseers would be attending church or sleeping off Saturday nights drinking. Mama Bridget had provided them with detailed instructions about what to bring and what to expect, though much of her advice seemed to involve spiritual preparations rather than practical considerations. Each man was told to bring a personal item that had belonged to a deceased family member, as well as a small amount of their own blood, which would be used in the ritual that would supposedly grant them access to the treasure. They were also instructed to fast for 3 days before the expedition and to avoid contact with women during this period, as Mama Bridget claimed that feminine energy would interfere with the spiritual forces they would need to invoke. The practical preparations were more straightforward. The men gathered supplies for what they expected to be a 3-day journey into the swamp: food, water, rope, tools for digging, and weapons for protection against the swamp's natural predators. They also pooled their meager resources to purchase a flat-bottomed boat that would allow them to navigate the swamp's waterways more easily than trying to travel on foot through the treacherous terrain. On the morning of October 15, 1887, the 19 men met at a predetermined location on the edge of Honey Island Swamp. Mama Bridget was waiting for them, dressed in a flowing white robe and carrying a leather bag filled with what she claimed were sacred objects necessary for the ritual. Her appearance that morning was even more unsettling than usual. Her ancient face seemed to have taken on an otherworldly quality, and her eyes held a gleam that spoke of knowledge and power that went far beyond normal human understanding. The old woman led them to a hidden channel that penetrated deep into the heart of the swamp. A waterway so narrow and overgrown that it was invisible from the main river. As their boat pushed through the curtain of hanging moss and twisted branches, the men felt as if they were entering another world entirely. The sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the eerie calls of birds they couldn't identify and the splash of unseen creatures moving through the dark water. The deeper they traveled into the swamp, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew thick and humid, carrying scents of decay and vegetation that seemed almost overwhelming. The water itself was black as ink, reflecting the canopy of cypress trees like a dark mirror. Spanish moss hung from every branch, creating a natural curtain that blocked out much of the sunlight and cast everything in a perpetual twilight. Samuel Washington, whose experience in the outdoors was extensive, was the first to notice that something was wrong with the wildlife in this part of the swamp. The usual chorus of frogs and insects that should have been active during the day had fallen silent, replaced by an unnatural quiet that seemed to press against their eardrums. Even more disturbing, the alligators that should have been sunning themselves on logs and mud banks were nowhere to be seen, as if they had fled from something that even apex predators feared. As they traveled deeper into the swamp, Mama Bridget began to chant in a language that none of the men recognized. Her voice took on harmonics that seemed impossible for a human throat to produce, and the very air around them seemed to vibrate with each syllable she uttered. Several of the men reported feeling dizzy and disoriented, as if the chanting was affecting their ability to think clearly. The temperature began to fluctuate wildly as they penetrated further into the swamp's heart. One moment the air would be stifling hot, causing the men to sweat profusely despite the shade, and the next it would drop to a bone-chilling cold that made their breath visible in the humid air. These temperature changes seemed to follow no natural pattern, occurring suddenly and without any apparent cause. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau, whose family had lived in the Bayou country for generations, became increasingly agitated as they traveled deeper into the swamp. His weather sense, which had never failed him before, seemed to be completely confused by the atmospheric conditions they were encountering. The sky above the canopy appeared normal, but the air itself felt charged with an energy that made his skin crawl and his hair stand on end. After several hours of travel through increasingly narrow and twisted waterways, Mama Bridget finally called for them to stop at what appeared to be a small island in the heart of the swamp. The island was covered with ancient cypress trees whose massive trunks spoke of centuries of growth, and the ground was carpeted with a thick layer of moss that seemed to glow with an eerie phosphorescence in the dim light. At the center of the island, barely visible through the undergrowth, stood the ruins of what had once been a substantial stone structure. The walls were covered with vines and moss, but the basic outline of a Spanish colonial building was still discernible. This, Mama Bridget announced, was the mission where the treasure lay hidden, protected by spirits that had guarded it for over a century. The old woman led the 19 men to a clearing in front of the ruined mission, where she began to prepare for the ritual that would supposedly grant them access to the treasure. She drew complex symbols in the soft earth using a mixture of what appeared to be ash, blood, and other substances from her leather bag. The symbols seemed to shift and change when viewed peripherally, and several of the men found themselves unable to look directly at them without feeling nauseous. As the afternoon wore on, Mama Bridget's preparations became increasingly elaborate and disturbing. She had the men arrange themselves in a circle around the symbols she had drawn, each one standing on a specific mark that corresponded to their position in what she called the Great Working. She then began to chant again, but this time her voice was joined by what sounded like other voices coming from the ruins themselves, as if the stones were somehow participating in the ritual. The air in the clearing began to thicken and take on a reddish hue that had nothing to do with the setting sun. The temperature fluctuations became more extreme, and several of the men reported seeing shapes moving in their peripheral vision, figures that vanished whenever they tried to look directly at them. The very ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse with a rhythm that matched no natural heartbeat. Marcus Freeman, whose desperation had driven him to join the expedition despite his better judgment, was the first to try to leave the circle. As he stepped toward the edge of the clearing, he suddenly stopped as if he had hit an invisible wall, his face contorted with terror as he tried to move forward but found himself unable to take another step. When he attempted to speak, no sound emerged from his mouth, as if his voice had been stolen by some unseen force. The other men watched in horror as Marcus struggled against whatever was holding him in place. His eyes were wide with panic, and his mouth moved silently as he tried to call for help. After several minutes of this terrifying pantomime, he suddenly relaxed and returned to his position in the circle, but his expression had changed completely. The desperation and fear that had characterized his features were gone, replaced by a blank, emotionless stare that suggested his mind was no longer entirely his own. One by one, the other men began to experience similar episodes. Patrick O'Malley tried to break free from the circle and found himself frozen in place, his Irish temper replaced by the same vacant expression that now characterized Marcus's face. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau attempted to use his knowledge of the swamp to find an escape route, but he too became trapped by invisible forces and returned to the circle with his personality fundamentally altered. As the sun set over Honey Island Swamp, the true horror of their situation began to become clear. The 19 men were not simply participating in a treasure-hunting expedition. They had become unwilling participants in a supernatural ritual that was designed to harvest something far more valuable than gold or silver. Mama Bridget, it became apparent, was not merely a voodoo practitioner seeking to help desperate workers, but something far more ancient and malevolent. The entity that had taken the form of Mama Bridget began to reveal its true nature as darkness fell over the swamp. The elderly Creole woman's appearance started to shift and change, her weathered features becoming more angular and predatory. Her eyes, which had always held an unsettling gleam, now glowed with an inner light that had nothing to do with reflected illumination. Her voice, when she spoke, carried harmonics that no human vocal cords could produce. The ritual circle that had been drawn in the earth began to glow with the same phosphorescent light that emanated from the moss, and the symbols seemed to writhe and move as if they were alive. The ruins of the Spanish mission, which had appeared to be nothing more than crumbling stone walls, began to take on a more substantial appearance, as if the building was somehow reconstructing itself from the memories embedded in the very stones. The treasure that Mama Bridget had promised was indeed real, but it was not the gold and silver that the men had expected. Instead, the entity revealed that the true treasure was the life force and spiritual energy of human beings, which could be harvested through the ritual and used to maintain its existence in the physical world. The Spanish mission had been built on a site sacred to entities that existed between the physical and spiritual realms, and the building itself had become a conduit for supernatural forces that fed on human suffering and desperation. The 19 men found themselves unable to move or speak as the entity began the final phase of its ritual. One by one, they began to feel their life force being drained away, their memories and personalities being absorbed into the malevolent consciousness that had lured them to this place. The process was not quick or merciful, it was designed to extract maximum suffering and terror, as these emotions seemed to enhance the spiritual energy that the entity could harvest. Samuel Washington, whose decades of experience had made him one of the most respected workers on the plantation, was among the first to succumb to the entity's hunger. His extensive knowledge of sugar cultivation and his memories of life before and after the Civil War were absorbed into the creature's consciousness, adding to its understanding of human nature and its ability to manipulate future victims. His body remained standing in the circle, But his eyes became as vacant and lifeless as those of a corpse. Jean-Baptiste Thibodeau's weather sense and his deep connection to the natural rhythms of Louisiana were particularly prized by the entity. As his life force was drained away, his ability to predict storms and understand the subtle signs of nature became part of the creature's supernatural arsenal. His family's generations of accumulated wisdom about living in harmony with the Bayou country was consumed along with his soul. The process continued throughout the night, with the entity savoring each victim's unique knowledge and experiences. Marcus Freeman's desperate love for his family and his determination to provide for them became twisted into a tool for manipulating future victims who found themselves in similar circumstances. Patrick O'Malley's immigrant dreams and his fierce pride in his Irish heritage were absorbed and corrupted, becoming part of the entity's understanding of human ambition and cultural identity. As dawn approached, only 3 of the 19 men remained conscious and aware. These 3, Thomas Boudreau, no relation to the plantation owner, Isaiah Johnson, and Pierre Landry, had somehow resisted the entity's influence. Though they were powerless to help their companions or escape from the ritual circle, they watched in horror as their friends and fellow workers were reduced to empty shells, their bodies still functioning but their minds and souls completely consumed. The entity, satisfied with its harvest but not yet ready to complete the ritual, revealed to the 3 survivors that they had been spared for a specific purpose. They were to return to the world of men and spread word of the treasure that could be found in Honey Island Swamp, ensuring that future groups of desperate individuals would be drawn to this place. Their survival was not an act of mercy but a calculated investment in the entity's long-term feeding strategy. As the sun rose over the swamp, the ruins of the Spanish mission began to fade back into their decrepit state, and the supernatural energy that had charged the air throughout the night gradually dissipated. The 16 men who had been consumed by the entity remained standing in the circle, but they were no longer truly alive. Their bodies had become vessels for fragments of the creature's consciousness, puppets that could be animated when needed but that possessed no independent will or awareness. The 3 survivors found themselves able to move again as the ritual circle lost its power with the coming of dawn. They were weak and disoriented, their minds struggling to process the supernatural horrors they had witnessed. The boat that had brought them to the island was still there, but it seemed impossibly small and fragile compared to the cosmic forces they had encountered during the night. Thomas Boudreau, a distant cousin of the plantation owner who had been working to pay off debts inherited from his father, was the first to regain enough composure to speak. His voice was hoarse and barely audible as he tried to convince his companions that they needed to leave the island immediately. The presence of the entity still lingered in the air, and he feared that it might change its mind about allowing them to survive. Isaiah Johnson, a former slave whose literacy and intelligence had made him valuable as a record keeper on the plantation, was struggling with the theological implications of what they had witnessed. His deep Christian faith was shaken by the encounter with supernatural evil, and he found himself questioning everything he had believed about the nature of good and evil. In the world, the entity's casual consumption of human souls challenged his understanding of divine justice and protection. Pierre Landry, a young Cajun whose family had been displaced by the changing economics of post-war Louisiana, was perhaps the most traumatized of the 3 survivors. His youth and relative innocence had made the night's horrors particularly difficult to process, and he was showing signs of severe psychological shock. His hands shook uncontrollably, and he seemed unable to focus on anything for more than a few seconds at a time. The journey back through Honey Island Swamp was a nightmare of confusion and terror. The 3 survivors found that their memories of the route they had taken to reach the island were hazy and unreliable, as if the entity had deliberately obscured their recollections to make escape more difficult. The waterways that had seemed clearly marked on their inward journey now appeared to branch and divide in impossible ways, creating a maze that threatened to trap them in the swamp forever. The 16 bodies of their consumed companions had vanished with the dawn, leaving no trace of their existence except for the memories carried by the 3 survivors. This disappearance would later complicate efforts to investigate their claims, as there was no physical evidence to support their accounts of what had happened on the island. The entity had been careful to eliminate any proof that might lead to unwanted attention from authorities or supernatural investigators. As they struggled to find their way out of the swamp, the 3 men began to experience disturbing psychological effects that seemed to be aftereffects of their exposure to the entity's influence. They reported hearing voices calling their names from the water, seeing faces in the patterns of moss and shadow, and feeling an overwhelming compulsion to return to the island where their companions had been consumed. These effects would persist for the rest of their lives, serving as a constant reminder of their supernatural encounter. The wildlife of the swamp, which had been conspicuously absent during their journey to the island, began to return as they moved away from the entities. Influence. Alligators appeared on mud banks, birds resumed their calling, and the normal sounds of swamp life gradually replaced the unnatural silence that had characterized the deeper regions. This return to normalcy was both comforting and unsettling, as it emphasized just how far they had traveled into a realm where natural laws no longer applied. It was late afternoon when the three survivors finally emerged from Honey Island Swamp, their boat scraping against the muddy bank of the Pearl River with a sound that seemed impossibly loud after the supernatural silence they had experienced. They were dehydrated, exhausted, and traumatized, their clothes torn and their bodies covered with insect bites and scratches from their desperate journey through the undergrowth. The first people to encounter the three survivors were local fishermen who initially assumed they had simply become lost in the swamp and were suffering from exposure and dehydration. The men's wild claims about supernatural entities and consumed souls were dismissed as the ravings of minds affected by swamp fever or toxic plants. It would be days before anyone took their account seriously enough to mount any kind of investigation. When the three survivors finally reached the Boudreaux plantation, they found that their absence had barely been noticed. Augustin Boudreaux was more concerned about the loss of 16 workers during the crucial harvest season than he was about the supernatural claims being made by the survivors. He demanded to know where the missing men had gone and threatened to add the cost of replacing them to the survivors' already substantial deaths. The local authorities were equally skeptical of the survivors' accounts. Sheriff Claude Thibodeau, no relation to Jean-Baptiste, was a practical man who had little patience for what he considered to be tall tales designed to cover up some kind of criminal activity. That he suspected that the three survivors had murdered their companions for some unknown reason and had concocted the supernatural story to avoid prosecution. However, the consistency of the three men's accounts, despite being questioned separately and repeatedly, began to convince some investigators that something genuinely unusual had occurred in Honey Island Swamp. The men described identical details about the entity's appearance, the ritual circle, and the supernatural phenomena they had witnessed, even under intense interrogation designed to reveal inconsistencies in fabricated stories. Dr. Henri Boudreaux, the plantation owner's brother and a physician with an interest in mental disorders, was brought in to examine the three survivors. His medical evaluation revealed that while the men showed signs of severe psychological trauma, they displayed none of the symptoms typically associated with shared delusions or group hysteria. Their accounts remained consistent even under the influence of laudanum and other substances that typically caused patients to reveal hidden truths or admit to deceptions. The investigation was further complicated by the complete absence of any physical evidence to support the survivors' claims. Search parties sent into Honey Island Swamp found no trace of the missing 16 men, no evidence of the Spanish mission ruins, and no indication that any kind of ritual had taken place on the island described by the survivors. The swamp seemed to have swallowed all evidence of the supernatural encounter, leaving only the testimonies of three traumatized men. Thomas Boudreaux, whose family connection to the plantation owner gave him slightly more credibility than his companions, was eventually able to convince his cousin to fund a more extensive search of the swamp. Professional guides and experienced hunters were hired to explore every accessible part of Honey Island Swamp, but their efforts yielded no results. The island where the ritual had allegedly taken place could not be located, despite detailed descriptions provided by the survivors. Isaiah Johnson's literacy and his reputation as a reliable record keeper led some members of the local community to take his account more seriously than those of his companions. That he was able to provide written testimony that included details about the entity's appearance and behavior that seemed too specific and consistent to be the product of imagination or deception. His deep religious faith also lent credibility to his claims, as many people found it difficult to believe that such a devout Christian would fabricate stories involving supernatural evil. Pierre Landry's youth and obvious psychological trauma made him a sympathetic figure, but it also undermined the credibility of his testimony. Many observers assumed that his accounts were the product of a young mind overwhelmed by some kind of traumatic experience, possibly involving the deaths of his companions through natural causes. His inability to provide coherent answers to certain questions was seen as evidence that his memories had been distorted by shock and fear. As weeks passed and no trace of the missing 16 men was found, the official investigation was quietly closed. The disappearances were attributed to a swamp accident, possibly involving quicksand or alligator attacks, and the survivors' supernatural claims were dismissed as trauma-induced fantasies. The case was filed away and largely forgotten by the authorities, though it continued to circulate as folklore throughout the region. The 3 survivors found their lives fundamentally changed by their experience in Honey Island Swamp. Thomas Boudreau was unable to continue working on the plantation, as the stress of his encounter with the supernatural had left him with chronic health problems that made physical labor impossible. His cousin Augustine showed little sympathy for his condition, adding medical expenses to his already substantial debt and threatening him with legal action if he attempted to leave the plantation. Isaiah Johnson's faith, which had been shaken by his encounter with supernatural evil, eventually led him to become a traveling preacher who warned rural communities about the dangers of seeking easy solutions to life's problems. His sermons often included veiled references to his experience in Honey Island Swamp, though he was careful never to provide enough detail to be accused of spreading superstitious nonsense. His message resonated with many people who were struggling with poverty and desperation in the post-war South. Pierre Landry never fully recovered from the psychological trauma of his experience. He became increasingly reclusive and paranoid, convinced that the entity from Honey Island Swamp was still watching him and waiting for an opportunity to complete its harvest. He moved frequently, never staying in one place long enough to form lasting relationships or establish a stable life. His family and friends watched helplessly as he deteriorated mentally and physically, eventually dying alone in a charity hospital in New Orleans at the age of 32. The entity's influence on the 3 survivors extended far beyond their initial encounter. All 3 men reported ongoing supernatural experiences throughout their lives, including prophetic dreams, encounters with spirits, and an uncanny ability to sense supernatural presences. These abilities seemed to be side effects of their exposure to the entity's power, marking them as individuals who had crossed the boundary between the natural and supernatural worlds. The missing 16 men were never found, but their disappearance had lasting effects on their families and the broader community. Wives became widows without bodies to bury, children grew up without fathers, and parents mourned sons whose fates remained unknown. The economic impact was also significant, as these men had been supporting extended families through their plantation wages, and their disappearance left many people destitute. The Boudreau plantation continued to operate after the incident, but it never fully recovered from the loss of so many experienced workers during the crucial harvest season. Augustine Boudreau found it increasingly difficult to recruit and retain workers, as word of the mysterious disappearances spread throughout the region. The plantation's reputation for exploitation was now compounded by rumors of supernatural danger, making it an even less attractive place to work. The incident also had broader implications for the sugar industry in Louisiana. The disappearance of 16 workers in a single incident highlighted the dangerous conditions and exploitative practices that characterized many plantations in the post-war period. Reform movements used the case as an example of how desperation and debt peonage could drive workers to take extraordinary risks, though they focused on the economic rather than supernatural aspects of the story. Local voodoo practitioners and other spiritual advisors found themselves in increased demand following the incident, as people sought protection against supernatural threats and guidance in dealing with otherworldly encounters. The story of Honey Island Swamp became part of the oral tradition of Louisiana's African American and Creole communities, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting entities that promised easy solutions to life's problems. The Catholic Church, which had a strong presence in Louisiana, struggled with how to respond to the supernatural claims made by the survivors. Some priests dismissed the accounts as superstitious nonsense, while others saw them as evidence of demonic activity that required serious theological consideration. The Church's official position was that such matters should be investigated carefully before any conclusions were drawn, but no formal investigation was ever conducted. The incident influenced the development of folklore throughout the Gulf Coast region, with similar stories of supernatural entities luring desperate people into swampland appearing in the oral traditions of multiple communities. These tales served both as entertainment and as warnings, reminding listeners that some solutions to life's problems came with prices that were too high to pay. Modern researchers have attempted to investigate the Honey Island swamp incident using contemporary scientific methods, but their efforts have been hampered by the passage of time and the lack of physical evidence. The swamp itself has changed significantly since 1887, with logging, development, and natural processes altering the landscape beyond recognition. If the island described by the survivors ever existed, it may have been destroyed or made inaccessible by more than a century of environmental change. Paranormal investigators continue to be drawn to Honey Island Swamp, conducting expeditions in search of evidence related to the 1887 incident. While no conclusive proof has been found, some investigators report experiencing unusual phenomena in certain parts of the swamp, including temperature fluctuations, electronic equipment malfunctions, and sightings of unexplained lights or figures. The psychological profiles of the 3 survivors have been studied by researchers interested in trauma and its effects on memory and perception. All 3 men exhibited symptoms consistent with severe post-traumatic stress disorder, but their accounts remained remarkably consistent throughout their lives, even under various forms of psychological examination. This consistency has led some researchers to conclude that the men genuinely believed they had experienced supernatural events, regardless of the objective reality of their claims. The case has also attracted the attention of anthropologists studying the cultural and religious practices of 19th-century Louisiana. The ritual described by the survivors contains elements that are consistent with various African, Native American, and European magical traditions, suggesting either genuine supernatural activity or an elaborate deception based on extensive knowledge of multiple occult systems. The economic aspects of the case have been analyzed by historians studying labor relations in the post-Civil War South. The debt peonage system that trapped the 19 workers was typical of the exploitative practices that replaced slavery throughout the region, and the desperation that drove them to seek supernatural solutions was a common feature of life for many working-class people during this period. The environmental conditions described by the survivors have been compared to known phenomena in swampland ecosystems, with some researchers suggesting that natural processes might account for some of the unusual experiences reported by the men. However, the complete absence of wildlife and the extreme temperature fluctuations described in their accounts have no known natural explanations and remain among the most puzzling aspects of their testimony. The influence of the Honey Island swamp incident on subsequent supernatural folklore cannot be overstated. Elements of the story appear in numerous other tales of entities that prey on human desperation, and the archetype of the false guide who leads victims to supernatural doom has become a standard feature of Southern Gothic literature and folklore. The 3 survivors' later lives were marked by their shared trauma and the burden of carrying knowledge that few would believe. They maintained contact with each other throughout their lives, providing mutual support and validation for their experiences. Their correspondence, preserved in family archives, provides additional insight into the long-term psychological effects of their supernatural encounter. The case has influenced the development of modern paranormal investigation techniques, as researchers have used the detailed accounts provided by the survivors as a template for documenting and analyzing supernatural phenomena. The consistency and specificity of their descriptions have provided valuable insights into how multiple witnesses experience and remember extraordinary events. The legal implications of the case were complex and unprecedented. How does one prosecute crimes committed by supernatural entities? The complete disappearance of 16 individuals without any physical evidence created challenges for law enforcement that had no precedent in legal history. The case highlighted the limitations of conventional justice systems when dealing with phenomena that exist outside normal human understanding. The incident also raised questions about the responsibility of employers to protect workers from supernatural as well as natural dangers. While Augustin Boudreau could not reasonably have been expected to anticipate supernatural threats to his workers, his exploitative labor practices had created the desperation that made them vulnerable to the entity's manipulation. The story of Honey Island Swamp has been preserved not only through the survivors' accounts but also through the oral traditions of Louisiana's various cultural communities. Local storytellers have kept the tale alive for generations, often adding their own embellishments and interpretations that reflect the values and beliefs of their communities. The incident has also influenced the development of modern understanding of psychological trauma and its effects on memory and perception. The survivors' experiences provided early documentation of what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder, and their consistent accounts despite severe trauma challenged contemporary assumptions about the reliability of witness testimony under extreme stress. As we reach the end of this harrowing journey into the heart of Honey Island Swamp, we are left with questions that challenge our understanding of reality itself. What really happened to those 16 men who vanished without a trace in the Louisiana wilderness? Was the entity that called itself Mama Bridget a supernatural predator that fed on human desperation, or was it something even more sinister, a force that existed at the intersection of human need and cosmic horror? The 3 survivors took their secrets to their graves, but their testimonies remain as a warning to all who would seek easy solutions to life's most difficult problems. In the murky waters of Louisiana's swampland, where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural have always been thin, some treasures come with prices that no human being should ever be asked to pay. The ruins of the Spanish mission may have vanished with the morning light, but the legend lives on in the whispered stories of those who know that some promises are too good to be true, and some guides should never be followed into the darkness. For in the end, when desperation drives us to seek salvation from forces beyond human understanding, we may find that the price of our freedom is nothing less than our souls. If this chilling tale of supernatural predation and the price of desperation has left you questioning what lurks beneath the surface of our everyday struggles, please show your support by hitting that like button. Your engagement helps us continue to uncover these forgotten chapters of history that remind us why some solutions are more dangerous than the problems they promise to solve. And if you haven't already joined our community of truth seekers here at Bayou Nightmares, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We delve deep into the shadows of history every week, bringing you stories that mainstream sources often overlook or dismiss, from the haunted swamplands of Louisiana to the dark corners of human desperation. We explore the mysteries that shaped our world. It's important to remember that while the stories we share on Bayou Nightmares are carefully researched and based on historical accounts, they are presented as entertainment and educational content. Some elements may be dramatized or interpreted through the lens of folklore and legend, though they are often inspired by real events and genuine human experiences that deserve to be remembered and understood. Until we meet again in the shadows of history, keep questioning the easy answers, keep seeking the truth behind the legends, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones that prey on our deepest needs and most desperate hopes. This has been Bayou Nightmares, where the past never truly dies, and the darkest secrets eventually find their way to the light.